Picture this: James Carter, a visionary leader and the CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the nation, sitting alone in his sleek, high-rise office. He isn't contemplating the next groundbreaking innovation or a market expansion. No, James is troubled by something far more profound, something unsettling. The employee satisfaction reports from one of his regional offices have taken a nosedive, a staggering 20% decline. More troubling are whispers of favoritism, toxic leadership, and even subtle, insidious racism brewing within the ranks. This isn't just bad for morale, it threatens the very soul of his company. Now, James didn't get to the top by ignoring problems or hiding behind his title. But how does a CEO, insulated by layers of management, uncover the truth? How does he break through the polished presentations and curated feedback to see what's really happening? What follows is a story that will both shock and inspire you. It's a story of a leader stepping down from his pedestal, disguising himself as the lowest rung on the ladder, and discovering a side of his company he never imagined. But let me warn you, the journey isn't smooth. It's raw, it's real, it's eye-opening. Before we dive in, if you're moved by stories of resilience, transformation, and leadership that breaks the mold, make sure to subscribe to our channel. If this story resonates with your heart and sparks your curiosity, we'd love to have you join our community. Now, let's get to it. James leaned back in his chair, staring at the numbers on the screen. A 20% drop in employee satisfaction wasn't just a blip on the radar, it was a siren. The reports described growing discontent in one of his flagship offices, a hub that had always been a model of efficiency and innovation. The problem wasn't just operational, it was cultural. Employees were describing their workplace as toxic. Allegations of favoritism and even subtle racial bias emerged in anonymous feedback. James's mind raced back to his own journey, the obstacles he'd faced as a black man climbing the corporate ladder. He knew firsthand how systemic biases could eat away at the spirit of even the most dedicated employees. At his company, the one he built on principles of inclusivity and meritocracy, become just another place where talent was stifled and inequities thrived. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him. The faces of the employees he passed in the hallways flashed through his mind. How many of them were carrying burdens he couldn't see? How many of them felt unseen, unheard, undervalued? The reports didn't just highlight problems, they revealed a disconnect. James realized he'd become insulated from the daily grind. The layers of management, however well-meaning, acted as a buffer. He wasn't just their CEO, he was a figurehead, an abstract authority, and that made him part of the problem. The question loomed: how could he fix something he didn't fully understand? That night, as he stared out over the city lights, an idea began to take shape. It was bold, it was unconventional, but James knew it was the only way to truly understand what was happening within the walls of his company. He had to step out of his role as CEO and step into the shoes of those at the front lines. Little did he know, this decision would change not only his perspective, but the trajectory of his entire organization. And here's the catch. As James prepares to step into a world vastly different from his corner office, the challenges he faces will expose not just the flaws in his company, but the strength within its people. In the next, you'll see how James takes the plunge, leaving behind the privileges of his title to uncover truths that would leave most speechless. Stay tuned, because what he discovers isn't just shocking, it's transformative. James Carter woke up the next morning with a plan, one that was as unorthodox as it was necessary. He decided he would go undercover, taking on the role of a receptionist in the very office where the problems were most severe. For a CEO of his stature, it wasn't just about humility, it was about visibility. To truly understand the culture and the cracks beneath the surface, he needed to see the day-to-day operations through the eyes of the people on the ground. The idea wasn't easy to execute. James couldn't just walk into the office and start answering phones. He needed a cover story, an alias, and a complete transformation. gone were the sharp suits and polished leather shoes. Instead, he donned plain slacks, a button-down shirt, and sneakers. His team created a backstory. James Harris, a mid-career receptionist filling in temporarily through a staffing agency. He'd practiced his demeanor, shedding the confidence and authority of a CEO to adopt a humble approach of someone just trying to do their job. As he walked into the office for the first time, the environment felt starkly different. The energy was subdued, conversations hushed. Employees shuffled to their desks, avoiding eye contact. It was a stark contrast to the vibrant atmosphere he remembered from his visits as CEO. But those visits were rare and staged. This was raw, unfiltered reality. James took his place at the reception desk, his heart pounding. The phone rang incessantly, emails flooded in, and people passed him without a second glance. The work was tedious, but it gave him a chance to observe. He noticed subtle patterns, how certain employees were treated differently, how some avoided the management team altogether, and how others carried a visible weight of frustration. In the break room, James overheard snippets of conversations. Employees complained about the lack of recognition, unfair promotions, and dismissive attitudes from the leadership. One comment struck him like a lightning bolt. It's like they don't care about us as people, just numbers on a spreadsheet. For James, it was a revelation. As CEO, he had always prided himself on fostering a supportive, inclusive environment. Yet here he was, facing the harsh reality that those values weren't filtering down to every corner of the organization. The gap between his vision and the employees' lived experience was wider than he'd imagined. The real test came when he interacted directly with the management team. Posing as a receptionist, he was treated with a mix of indifference and, in some cases, outright condescension. One manager, in particular, barely acknowledged his presence, barking orders as if he were invisible. For James, it was a humbling experience, a stark reminder of how power dynamics can erode basic human respect. Despite the challenges, James knew he was on the right track. By blending into the fabric of the office, he was gaining insights that no report or second-hand account could provide. But the more he saw, the more questions arose. Who were the real drivers of the toxic culture? Was it a handful of bad actors, or was the problem systemic? What James was about to uncover next would shock him to his core. In the next, you'll see how James's deeper interactions reveal not just neglect, but active dysfunction within the leadership team. And trust me, the actions of one manager in particular will leave you shaking your head. Stay with us. You won't want to miss what happens next. James quickly discovered that life at the reception desk was no walk in the park. From the moment he sat down, he was inundated with tasks that seemed mundane on the surface, but demanded a level of mental dexterity he hadn't expected. Calls poured in from clients and internal departments. Meetings needed to be coordinated, and last-minute requests became the norm. Yet, it wasn't just the workload that struck him. It was the way people treated him. Some employees greeted him with kindness, but others barely acknowledged his presence. The dismissive glances and clipped tones weren't directed at James the CEO. They were aimed at James the receptionist. He realized that this was the reality for many employees in lower-level roles. They were invisible unless someone needed something. One morning, James noticed something disturbing. A manager walked past him, loudly berating an assistant for a minor error. The reprimand was public, humiliating, and completely disproportionate to the mistake. James's stomach churned. He thought of the countless employees who had likely endured similar treatment, afraid to speak out or defend themselves for fear of retaliation. Over the course of several days, James began piecing together a clearer picture of the workplace dynamics. During lunch breaks, he overheard casual conversations among employees. Complaints about long hours and lack of appreciation were common, but one theme stood out: favoritism. Employees talked about how promotions seemed to depend less on merit and more on personal connections with certain managers. The hardest moments came when James encountered blatant disregard for the company's values. One afternoon, as he sorted through the mail, he overheard two managers discussing complaints that had been submitted through the anonymous employee feedback system. "It's just whining," one manager scoffed. "If they don't like it, they can leave." Hearing those words as a receptionist was infuriating, but as a CEO, it was heartbreaking. He realized that this dismissive attitude wasn't just toxic. It was a symptom of a deeper cultural problem. Employees felt unheard because their concerns were brushed aside by the very people responsible for addressing them. James also noticed how race played a subtle but undeniable role in the workplace dynamics. He observed how certain employees, particularly those from minority backgrounds, seemed to be held to higher standards than their peers. Their mistakes were scrutinized more harshly, their achievements celebrated less enthusiastically. For James, this hit close to home. He remembered his own struggles as a black professional and how hard he had worked to create opportunities for others like him. Seeing those barriers still present in his own company was a bitter pill to swallow. One day, James found himself in a conversation with a mid-level employee who had no idea he was speaking to the CEO. The man confided, "I've been here for 5 years and I still feel like I'm on probation. You're always being watched, waiting for someone to decide if you're worth keeping around." James nodded, his heart heavy. He was beginning to understand just how disconnected he had become from the reality of his employees' experiences. The office wasn't just suffering from inefficiencies, it was suffering from a lack of humanity. But amid the disheartening revelations, there were glimmers of hope. James noticed a few employees who went out of their way to lift others up. One of them was Emily, a quiet but driven accountant who stayed late every evening to ensure her team's reports were flawless. Another was David, a charismatic IT specialist who took the time to mentor new hires, even when it wasn't part of his job description. These individuals embodied the kind of culture James had always envisioned for his company. Still, the question remained, why were these examples of excellence the exception rather than the rule? What forces were at play that allowed a toxic environment to overshadow the good? James's time as a receptionist was proving to be both enlightening and humbling. He was starting to see the root causes of the dissatisfaction and dysfunction that had plagued the office. But what he didn't yet realize was that the worst and most shocking revelations were still to come. In the next, James's undercover journey takes a dramatic turn when he confronts one of the most toxic leaders in the office. What he witnesses will push him to the brink and force him to make a decision that could change everything. Stay tuned. You won't believe what happens next. Confronting the leadership crisis. As the days passed, James's observations became increasingly unsettling. The behavior of one manager in particular stood out as a glaring example of everything that had gone wrong in the office. Susan, the local operations manager, wielded her authority with an iron fist. Employees whispered her name with a mix of fear and resentment, and James saw why. Susan's leadership style was less about inspiring her team and more about controlling them through intimidation. She rarely offered praise or constructive feedback. Instead, she pointed out flaws with sharp words and cutting remarks, often in front of others. One morning, James watched as she berated a young marketing assistant for missing a deadline. The assistant tried to explain that she'd been waiting for Susan's approval on a project component. But Susan dismissed her excuses with a wave of her hand, declaring, "It's not my job to hold your hand." James's blood boiled as he watched the assistant shrink under Susan's gaze. This wasn't just poor management, it was toxic behavior that created a culture of fear. James made a mental note to check the assistant's personnel file later. If this was how Susan treated her team in public, what might she be doing behind closed doors? Later that day, James had a front row seat to Susan's disregard for company values during a tense conversation at the reception desk. A delivery driver had arrived with a package and asked for Susan by name. When James paged her, she came storming out of her office, visibly annoyed. The driver, a young black man, politely explained that there was an issue with the shipment and needed her signature to resolve it. Susan's response was curt and dismissive. "Can't you figure this out without bothering me?" she snapped. James saw the hurt flicker across the driver's face before he quickly masked it with a professional smile. As he walked away, Susan muttered under her breath, loud enough for James to hear, "Some people just don't belong in customer-facing roles." The comment hit James like a punch to the gut. It was subtle, veiled, but unmistakably prejudiced. That evening, James sat at his temporary desk, replaying the events of the day. Susan's behavior wasn't just an isolated issue. It was a symptom of a larger problem. Her actions went unchecked because there was no accountability. Employees like her thrived in environments where leadership prioritized results over people, where toxic habits could hide behind a veneer of strong performance metrics. But James's undercover role wasn't just about observing, it was about learning. He wanted to understand not just what was wrong, but why it had been allowed to fester. He spoke to employees during lunch breaks and coffee runs, gradually earning their trust. Over time, they opened up to him about their frustrations. One recurring theme emerged. Susan wasn't just intimidating employees, she was actively undermining them. One team member shared that Susan often claimed credit for their ideas in meetings with senior executives. Another described how Susan had sabotaged a colleague's project by withholding critical resources, only to turn around and blame them when the project failed. James began to piece together a pattern. Susan's behavior wasn't just damaging to morale, it was actively harming the company's performance. She was creating a culture where fear stifled innovation, where employees were too afraid to speak up, and where potential leaders were being driven out before they could shine. The final straw came when James witnessed Susan dismiss a junior employee's complaint about workplace harassment. The employee, visibly upset, had come to Susan for help after a coworker had made inappropriate comments. Susan's response was chilling. "If you can't handle a little teasing, maybe this isn't the right place for you." James felt a wave of anger and disbelief. This wasn't just bad leadership, it was negligence. He knew then that Susan couldn't remain in her position, but before he could act, he needed to uncover the full extent of her impact on the office and the culture. At this point, James faced a critical question. How could he address these issues without simply replacing one problem with another? He needed to ensure that the changes he made wouldn't just be surface level, but would create lasting improvements. What James didn't yet realize was that the toxic culture wasn't solely the result of individuals like Susan. There was another, darker force at play, one that would soon come to light in a way he never expected. In the next, James uncovers a shocking external plot designed to sabotage the office and his leadership. This revelation will turn everything on its head and push him to take bold, unprecedented action. Stay with us, because the story is about to take a dramatic turn. James's undercover experience had already revealed layers of dysfunction within the office. But as he delved deeper, he began to sense that something more sinister was at play. The complaints about toxic behavior, the whispers of favoritism, and even the morale issues, it all felt too coordinated, as if someone were pulling strings behind the scenes. One afternoon, while tidying the front desk, James overheard Susan speaking in hushed tones to a senior colleague in the hallway. "He knows too much," she said, her voice low but agitated. "If this blows up, I'll make sure the blame doesn't land on me." James froze. She didn't mention who he was, but the conversation suggested there was more going on than workplace incompetence. Later that week, James noticed something strange. A flood of emails to the anonymous employee feedback system suddenly stopped. When he asked around, employees mentioned that they no longer trusted the system, claiming their complaints were being traced back to them. One employee even revealed that they'd received a warning from Susan after submitting a grievance, though the system was supposed to be completely confidential. This was a turning point. James realized that Susan wasn't just a bad manager, she was actively suppressing dissent and manipulating the system to maintain her control. But how had she gained such unchecked authority? And why was no one stopping her? The answer came unexpectedly. Michael Grant, the company's lead investigator, reached out to James on a seemingly unrelated matter. Michael had been conducting an investigation into cybersecurity breaches when he stumbled upon suspicious activity tied to the office. Certain files, including sensitive personnel records and employee feedback submissions, had been accessed by an unauthorized user. Even more troubling, the activity traced back to a former employee, someone who had left the company years ago under contentious circumstances. James and Michael met to discuss the findings. The former employee in question, Robert Gray, had been a high-ranking manager in the same office. Robert had left amid allegations of misconduct, though nothing had been proven at the time. Now, it appeared he was orchestrating a campaign to destabilize the office from the outside, exploiting personal relationships and inside knowledge to sow discord. But why? As Michael dug deeper, he uncovered Robert's motive: revenge. Robert had blamed James personally for his dismissal and had spent years plotting a way to undermine his leadership. He'd used his connections within the office to feed Susan and other toxic managers the tools they needed to create chaos. In return, he provided them with cover and even leverage against employees who dared to challenge them. The pieces began to fall into place. Susan's brazen behavior wasn't just a product of her personality. It was fueled by the confidence that she had powerful backing. The anonymous feedback system had been compromised because Robert was funneling information back to Susan, enabling her to retaliate against employees who spoke out. James was stunned. The toxic culture wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of poor management. It was being actively cultivated by an external saboteur. This revelation shook him to his core. He had always believed in the resilience of his company's values, but now he saw how fragile they could be when the wrong people exploited the system. The next step was clear, but fraught with risk. James and Michael needed to gather concrete evidence to confront not only Susan, but also Robert and anyone else involved. This meant carefully navigating the office dynamics while continuing to play the role of an unassuming receptionist. For James, the stakes had never been higher. His credibility, his company's future, and the well-being of his employees all hung in the balance. As James prepared for the confrontation, he reflected on everything he had learned. The office wasn't just a microcosm of workplace dysfunction. It was a battlefield where integrity and sabotage were clashing. He realized that his leadership would ultimately be defined not by his ability to prevent problems, but by his willingness to face them head-on. What James uncovered next would set the stage for a dramatic showdown. The time for observation was over. It was time to act. In the next, James takes bold steps to confront the perpetrators, reveal the truth to his employees, and begin the process of rebuilding. But not everyone is ready to face the consequences of their actions. What happens next will test James's resolve and redefine what it means to lead. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. Armed with the information gathered by Michael Grant, James Carter was ready to act. The evidence was irrefutable. Susan had been collaborating with Robert Gray to destabilize the office, and their actions had rippled through the organization, leaving distrust, fear, and resentment in their wake. It was time to put an end to it. James convened a private meeting with Michael and his most trusted executives. For the first time since going undercover, he revealed the full extent of what he had uncovered during his time as a receptionist. The room was silent as James described Susan's actions, the compromised feedback system, and the influence of Robert Gray. Shock turned to determination as the team realized the gravity of the situation. Together, they developed a plan to address the issue swiftly and decisively. The next day, James returned to the office, not as James Harris, the temporary receptionist, but as James Carter, the CEO. The transformation was striking. The employees, accustomed to seeing him only in polished corporate settings, were taken aback by his presence in their day-to-day environment. He made no grand announcements. Instead, he quietly observed the reactions of those around him. Some appeared nervous, others hopeful, and a few, like Susan, visibly uneasy. The confrontation began with a town hall meeting. James addressed the entire office, speaking candidly about the issues that had been plaguing the organization. He acknowledged the decline in employee satisfaction and the allegations of favoritism and racism, vowing to take responsibility for the culture under his leadership. "I've always believed in leading by example," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what that truly means. Today, I'm here to set things right." Without naming names, James described the investigation into the compromised feedback system and the evidence of external interference. He assured employees that changes were coming, including enhanced security measures and a fully anonymous system for reporting grievances. "Your voices matter," he emphasized, "and we will make sure they're heard." Later that afternoon, James called Susan into a private meeting. Michael Grant was present, along with a senior HR representative. Susan's demeanor was defensive, but James remained calm as he laid out the evidence against her. He detailed her abuses of power, her role in suppressing employee feedback, and her connections to Robert Gray. "This is not leadership," James said, his tone firm. "This is manipulation, and it has no place in my company." Susan tried to deny the allegations, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her attempts to deflect responsibility only further highlighted her lack of accountability. In the end, James made it clear. Her employment with the company was terminated, effective immediately. But James wasn't done. The following day, he held a meeting with the remaining management team to discuss the cultural overhaul he planned to implement. He spoke openly about the importance of rebuilding trust and fostering a workplace where every employee felt valued. "We can't just remove the bad actors and call it a day," he said. "We need to look at the systems and structures that allowed this to happen in the first place." As part of the changes, James announced the promotion of 2 employees who had stood out during his undercover experience: Emily, the dedicated accountant, and David, the IT specialist who had gone above and beyond to support his colleagues. Both were visibly emotional as James praised their contributions in front of the team. "Leaders like Emily and David are the future of this company," he said. "They embody the values we strive for, and it's time we recognize and reward that." The changes didn't stop there. James implemented new leadership training programs focused on empathy, communication, and accountability. He introduced quarterly surveys to gauge employee satisfaction, with results shared transparently across the company. Most importantly, he committed to spending more time in the trenches, ensuring that he remained connected to the day-to-day experiences of his employees. The road to recovery wouldn't be easy, but James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The crisis had shaken him, but it had also given him a chance to rebuild his company on a stronger foundation. The most powerful moment came during a follow-up town hall meeting. An employee stood up and said, "For the first time in years, I feel like we're being heard. Thank you for listening and for acting." James nodded, humbled. "This isn't just my company," he replied. "It's ours. And together, we're going to make it better." But just as James began to feel hopeful, a new challenge emerged, a twist he never saw coming. Stay with us, because the final chapter of this story will reveal the ultimate test of James's leadership and the legacy he's determined to leave behind. With Susan gone and the sabotage exposed, James Carter turned his attention to the daunting task of rebuilding the office's culture. The problems ran deeper than any one person, and the damage done couldn't be erased overnight. For James, the challenge was clear: to create lasting change. He needed to address the systemic issues that had allowed toxicity to take root. The first step was transparency. James scheduled a series of town hall meetings and small group sessions where employees could share their thoughts openly. He didn't just listen, He took notes, asked questions, and committed to action. "This is your company as much as mine," he told them. "If we're going to fix it, we need to do it together." One recurring theme emerged. Employees felt disconnected from leadership. They described a wall of silence that made it difficult to communicate their concerns or feel recognized for their contributions. James took this feedback to heart, implementing an open-door policy and encouraging other leaders to follow suit. He also created a rotating day-in-the-life program where executives would spend a day shadowing employees in various roles. The goal was simple: bridge the gap between the top and the front lines. But transparency was only part of the solution. James knew that real change required structural reforms. He worked with his HR team to overhaul the feedback system, introducing third-party oversight to ensure anonymity and impartiality. Performance reviews were revamped to prioritize collaboration, creativity, and respect for others, not just individual metrics. James also set out to redefine what leadership meant within the company. He introduced mandatory training sessions focused on empathy, conflict resolution, and diversity. Every manager, from the C-suite to the team leads, was required to participate. "Leadership isn't about power," James told them during the first session. "It's about service. If you're not helping your team succeed, you're not doing your job." While these changes were well received by many, not everyone was on board. A handful of managers resisted, arguing that the new policies were too lenient and would hurt productivity. James understood their concerns but remained steadfast. "Productivity at the expense of people isn't sustainable," he explained. "We're not just building a company, we're building a community." Amid the reforms, James faced a new challenge: rebuilding trust with the employees who had been most affected by the toxic culture. He made it a point to meet individually with those who had been mistreated, including the young assistant Susan had berated and the employee whose harassment complaint had been dismissed. In each conversation, James apologized personally and outlined the steps the company was taking to prevent similar incidents in the future. One particularly emotional meeting was with a longtime employee who had considered quitting after years of feeling undervalued. "I stayed because I believed in what this company could be," she told James, "but it's been hard." Her words stayed with him, a reminder of the resilience and loyalty that existed even in the face of adversity. As the months passed, the impact of the changes began to show. Employee satisfaction scores rose steadily, and the office atmosphere became noticeably lighter. Teams that had once operated in silos began collaborating more openly, and employees started speaking up in meetings without fear of retaliation. The office was still far from perfect, but the progress was undeniable. One moment stood out to James as a turning point. During a quarterly all-hands meeting, an employee asked, "How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" James paused before answering. "We stay vigilant," he said. "Culture isn't something you set and forget. It's something you nurture every day, through every decision, every interaction, every choice. And it starts with all of us." The meeting ended with a standing ovation, a powerful signal that the employees believed in the direction James was taking. But just as James began to feel a sense of closure, a new challenge emerged, a direct consequence of his reforms. A faction of disgruntled managers, frustrated by the changes, began stirring unrest, arguing that the company had become too soft. Their dissent threatened to undo the progress James had worked so hard to achieve. What followed would be the ultimate test of James's leadership and resolve. Could he navigate this new wave of resistance without compromising the values he had fought to restore? Stay with us, because in the final chapter, James faces his greatest challenge yet, and the decisions he makes will define his legacy. The office was transforming, but not everyone was celebrating the changes. As the new policies took root, a group of middle and senior managers began expressing their discontent. They whispered among themselves in meetings, exchanged pointed glances during leadership sessions, and even went as far as to criticize James's reforms openly to their teams. To them, The focus on transparency, inclusivity, and employee well-being was a distraction from the company's bottom line. James had anticipated some pushback. Change, especially on this scale, was rarely embraced without resistance. But the intensity of the dissent surprised him. It wasn't just grumbling, it was organized. Several managers circulated anonymous emails filled with exaggerated claims about declining productivity and alleged favoritism under the new system. These messages reached employees, sparking concern and confusion. The toxic leadership that James had sought to root out was attempting to claw its way back. What troubled James most was the effect this was having on the employees. Some began to question whether the reforms were genuine or simply another fleeting initiative. Others hesitated to embrace the new culture fully, afraid that the dissenters might regain power and retaliate. James realized that if he didn't address this resistance decisively, the progress they had made could unravel. James called a meeting with the dissenting managers, determined to address their concerns head-on. He opened the discussion with his usual calm but direct approach. "I understand that change can be uncomfortable," he began, "but our mission is to create a workplace where every employee can thrive. If you have concerns about how we're achieving that, let's talk about them openly." At first, the managers danced around the issue, framing their objections as logistical challenges or philosophical differences. But as James pressed for specifics, their true concerns emerged. "We've spent years building a results-driven culture," one manager said. "Now it feels like we're being told to coddle employees instead of holding them accountable." Another added, "Some of us feel like we're losing control. The authority we used to have is being undermined by all these changes." James listened carefully, his face unreadable. When they finished, he took a deep breath and spoke. "I hear your concerns, but let me be clear. Accountability and compassion are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they go hand in hand. A culture that values its people doesn't mean lower standards. It means higher ones, because people perform their best when they feel respected and supported." He paused, letting his words sink in. As for control, leadership isn't about exerting power over others. It's about empowering them. If that feels like a loss of control, then maybe we need to re-examine what leadership really means. The room fell silent. James could see that his words had struck a chord with some, but others remained unconvinced. He knew that not everyone would stay on board with the company's direction, and he was prepared for that. "I want you to take some time to reflect on this," he said. "But know this, these changes are not negotiable. Our values are not up for debate. If you can't align with them, it may be time to reconsider your role here." In the weeks that followed, several dissenting managers resigned. It wasn't an easy decision for James to let them go. Each had contributed to the company's success in their own way, but he knew that their resistance to the reforms posed a greater risk to the organization than their absence would. Their departures marked a turning point. The remaining leadership team rallied around James's vision, united by a shared commitment to the company's future. Employees, too, began to feel a renewed sense of optimism. The lingering fear and doubt gave way to hope and trust as they saw James stand firm in the face of opposition. 1 year after James's undercover journey, the office was almost unrecognizable. Employee satisfaction scores had reached an all-time high, and the company's financial performance had exceeded expectations. More importantly, the culture was thriving. Teams collaborated more effectively, employees spoke up without fear, and leaders at all levels embodied the values James had worked so hard to instill. In a final all-hands meeting to mark the anniversary of the reforms, James reflected on the journey. "This past year has been one of the most challenging of my career," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But it's also been the most rewarding. Together, we've proven that a company's greatest strength isn't its products, its profits, or even its leaders. It's its people." As the room erupted in applause, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road to this moment had been rocky, but it had been worth every step. But James's story doesn't end here. What he learned during this transformative journey continues to shape his leadership and the company's future. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We'll be sharing more stories of resilience, leadership, and transformation in the weeks to come. Because at the end of the day, every great company isn't just built, it's rebuilt. One decision, one person, and one value at a time. See you in the next video.